Yeah, like the wide angle. So if you move, if you walk, some of the
When I was
speakers like to
teaching,
walk.
I used to walk, but I don't like holding the mic. That's the problem. You're the one that
I don't have a lapel mic. No. The microphone that's there, I'll adjust so that you can have about as good audio quality as you're going to have standing there.
Because I have some slide down. Just let you go, brother. Getting here because we got a notice the day before saying there's going to be severe weather in the area.
Yeah.
So we were diverted yesterday. Not diverted, but we rerouted. So it took us an extra hour to get here.
All right. Turn it up a little bit. If there is any back I didn't send me a stand. Yeah, maybe we'll introduce you in a second.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, so USB.
Good morning. Consider this your 1-minute warning. We're going to go ahead and bring our speakers up here just about. Dylan, am I good if I don't move the mic?
And really, everybody should be holding it together just because
Good morning. So I asked you to take a seat, told you you had 1 minute, and you beat New York City for sure, because it took them like a half hour. So thank you, Texas. Good morning and welcome to the very last stop of the Teach Human Action Tour, and I'm so glad we have this here in Austin. It's been an incredibly welcome team from Texas and a welcoming city for sure. So my name is Amy Lepore. I'll be your host today. My job is to kind of let you know what the agenda is. I'll introduce all of your speakers. If you have questions about your tickets, if you have questions about lunch, any of the logistics, please just let me know. So again, grateful to do this here in Austin, Texas. You have an incredible Texas Mises Caucus. They work very hard. If you're not already plugged in, please make sure you do so while you're here today. The thing about being in Texas, it's cool. So I'm from Delaware, and I've been part of the Libertarian Party of Delaware, and you may be aware, in the last couple of years, we've gone through a little bit of trauma. And when I think about who from across the country came to our aid, there are people like Agatha in the back of the room, one of my very favorite students, and Carter Fanning. I don't think I see him here yet, but when I think about who came to the rescue and who continuously comes to aid their fellow Mises Caucus affiliates, I think of the team from Texas. So thank you guys for being so incredible, and thank you for having us here. So just a quick thing about the agenda for the weekend. So we have amazing speakers here. I think we have 7 or 8 speakers lined up for you. A couple of logistics. If you're here and you're parked in the hotel parking, make sure at registration they give you the parking discount ticket. Make sure that you got your bracelet for lunch. If you have any questions about those things, you can see the registration folks, or I can help you. Tonight, there is a meetup at a place called the Parlor and Yard. I think I got that right. With Angela McCardle. She'll be here today with us as well. And then tomorrow, if you have the opportunity, there's candidate training with Angela, Nate Polsky, and I want to say Joe Thomas will be here as well. So please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Thank you very much. So, we're here today. We have incredible speakers, lunch, and opportunity to network, to get to know your team from Texas if you don't know them yet. Tonight, an opportunity to socialize, to network as well. And tomorrow, an incredible and powerful opportunity to think about what it might be to be a candidate here in the state of Texas, what it might be to support a candidate if you're not doing that already. We have also a whole lot of sponsors who have been incredible, who have made sure that this tour can work for the Mises Caucus, getting us out in a whole bunch of cities all across the country. So we have a whole bunch of sponsors, and I'm gonna list them for you. Some of them are here, some of them are not, but if you get a chance to check them out, please do. So Stephen Kinsella, Action for Liberty, Sheath Underwear, Bring Our Troops Home, Gun Owners of America, who actually will be here, and they are one of their directors, is our lunch speaker today. Murray Sabrin, who's your first speaker, Mankato Guns, Fifth Company Brewing, Tiger Fitness, Replicator Suppressors, Pat Crest Botanicals, Taggart Training, Camino Point, Libertarian Christian Institute, Anthem Planning, Lone Star Injury Attorneys, and they are out in the hallway. If you get it there, there's Max Excellent, Liberty Speaks, and Mike Termat. So we are incredibly grateful for the sponsors who made this tour possible, and incredibly grateful that you would attend today to see our speakers. So without delay, I'm going to bring Maharrey Sabrin up. Maharrey, we're so glad that you're here. Maharrey is an accomplished author and professor who has his books out there if you have an opportunity to nab one. And anyone who publishes a title, Why the Federal Reserve Sucks, deserves this stage. So I'll bring him on up and let you know that he's been a tremendous supporter of the Mises Caucus as well. I know Mike often goes to you for guidance and your thoughts on how to move forward. So he has backed both this tour, and ARP has been a repeated guest on our podcast as well, and a resource for the caucus over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, Maharrey Sabrin.
Thank you, Amy, for those kind words, and appreciate being here in Alaska. I mean, have you had a cooler ballroom in your life than we have here today? Just think of what the globe would look like if we had this type of temperature all over the globe. Anyway, I would have brought my teleprompter this morning, but Joe Biden borrowed it 3 years ago and hasn't returned it yet. So obviously it hasn't helped him much. And so anyway, I have a lot to talk about. We only have about 35 minutes. So I'm going to try to condense a lot of the things I taught at Brownville College in my Financial History of the United States course. Several months ago, Michael called me and said, I got two things I want to run past you. One, would you be a speaker on our Human Action Tour, and would you be a sponsor? And without hesitation, I said yes to both of those requests. So here I am speaking about a subject that's near and dear to my heart, the U.S. economy. Michael is spot on with his decentralized revolution. Those of you that may not know, I was the 1997 Libertarian Party candidate in New Jersey. I was the first third-party candidate to raise enough funds to get a match from the state. We have a state matching funds program in New Jersey. And on 3 debates, I debated Governor Whitman and then Senator and Mayor Jim McGreevey. Dual office holding was common in New Jersey. It's no longer possible to do that. Anyway, by being a third-party candidate in debates with the Republican and Democratic candidates, I can tell you how shallow the opposition is on the issues. By the third debate, I knew exactly what the opponents were going to say on the questions posed to them on a whole host of topics: property taxes, education, partial birth abortion, automobile insurance, and so on and so forth. And so Michael has done something that I've been thinking about since 1997 when I ran a statewide campaign. And by the way, the National LP was instrumental in me getting the matching funds. The National LP sent out a fundraising letter to all their members, and with 2.5 weeks left before the deadline to file for matching funds, we were $140,000 short. In 2 weeks, LP members across the country sent in $150,000 in 2 weeks. That's in 1997. That's probably equivalent to about $500,000 today. And if you recall, in 1997, Virginia and New Jersey were the only states that had gubernatorial campaigns. So what was the strategy? To get my campaign noticed in New Jersey and around the country. And it was. C-SPAN carried the debates, the New York Times wrote articles, and so on and so forth. So the point is, Libertarian Party members across the country, if they think strategically, tactically, can move the needle, however slightly. And we moved the needle in 1997 and beyond. What was one of the big issues? Automobile insurance. New Jersey had very high rates. We had a lot of regulation, and I called for the deregulation of the auto insurance market. My Republican opponent, you would think that Republicans would be interested in deregulation? No. 4 years later, the Democrat Jim McGreevey gets elected. What does he do? He adopts my plan. You don't have to win elections to move the needle. Okay? I campaigned on having a 65 speed limit. New Jersey had a notorious 55 speed limit in 1997. Can you imagine driving on the turnpike, New Jersey Turnpike at 55 miles an hour? It's crawling. So I said, we should have a 65 speed limit. Both McGreevey and Whitman were against it. Why? They did focus groups. Senior citizens were opposed to raising the speed limit to 65. Whitman won the race in Squeaker. A few months later, she raised the speed limit to 65. You don't have to win to move the needle. Here's another thing that happened. In October, in the middle of the campaign, I came home from teaching at Brownville College. I get a note in my mailbox signed by a sergeant on a little piece of paper saying, you violated ordinance such and such of the town because you have a sign, a political sign on your property. Didn't they hear a free speech in Bergen County? The campaign lawyer went to the Superior Court judge. He immediately threw it out as a violation of my First Amendment rights, and that's now part of case law in the state of New Jersey. You don't have to win elections to promote the First Amendment or the Bill of Rights. So, having said that as a preamble to what I'm going to talk about with the economy, I'm going to ask a question now. Since I'm still, although I'm retired for now nearly 3 years, I still have my professorial hat on. I'm going to ask a couple of questions here. What do you think was the most important or consequential event in the post-war period in America? Raise your hand.
World Trade Center?
World Trade Center. Okay, that's a good one.
Gold standard?
The gold standard, Nixon, 1971. That's when I, by the way, left the Republican Party. All Nixon's advisors had Adam Smith ties, and they're imposing wage price controls. Could you be more disingenuous than that? So we got the gold standard, we got the World Trade Center.
The creation of the Fed.
Well, that's before 1945. That's a good one also. Plus the income tax.
Fall of Soviet Union.
The fall of the Soviet Union. Great stuff. Anybody else?
COVID regime.
Another great one. That's in line with Robert Higgs's book, Crisis and Leviathan. Every time there's a crisis, government expands but never recedes. Perfect case study of Crisis and Leviathan. Anybody else?
2008.
The Great Recession, 2008. Here's mine. I'll take you back to 1963, November 1963, when I was a senior in high school. I was going from my last class to homeroom, and people said that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. I said, couldn't happen. No way. That's a rumor. How could a president be assassinated with all the protection that a president has these days? So I took the train from Bedford Park Boulevard in the North Bronx, where I was at the Bronx High School of Science. 5 stops later, I got off, went up Burnside Avenue, saw my little brother there, and he said, the president's been assassinated. So I turned on the TV and Walter Cronkite was there. The Kennedy assassination literally changed the course of American history in ways we cannot contemplate, and probably world history. Because if Kennedy were not assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson would never have been president. We never would have had the Great Society, and we wouldn't have had the Vietnam War. Kennedy was prepared after the 1964 election to withdraw our troops that were there, the advisors from Vietnam. That was the most consequential event of my lifetime and America's. Because what Johnson did was cement the welfare warfare state on America. And both Republicans and Democrats have continued governing in that tradition. The endless wars of the Bushes, the expansion of the welfare state under the Bushes. It just goes on and on and on. So to me, the Kennedy assassination was the most consequential event in the post-World War II period in America. Ironically or incidentally, my memoir, which is outside, overseen by my wife, and in August we'll be married 55 years, like the speed limit in New Jersey, but it's a better 55. My memoir was published on November 22nd. I didn't plan it, the publisher didn't plan it, it just happened. It's just one of those random events. Now, this is a Mises Caucus event. I've been a member of the Mises Institute since it was created in 1982. I don't know if I got a call from Lou Rockwell or probably a letter, and I donated money, and I was unemployed at the time. I forgot what I donated, but I've been a donor ever since. Okay, and I'm wearing my pin here as being a donor to the Mises Institute. And if you're ever on Jeopardy, and this question comes up, 2 questions come up, you'll have the answer. What does George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump and Maharrey Sabrin have in common? Born in the same year, but not in the USA. I was born in West Germany right after World War II, and it's all in my memoir. Here's another trivia question. Who are the only two people who have received a PhD on the Murray Rothbard?
Arthur Burns?
No, Rothbard studied under Arthur Burns. But whose dissertation committees did Rothbard serve on? Only two people in the history of academia. No?
I'm gonna guess you.
Yes. No, it was Rob Bradley, who was an energy economist. I think here in Texas, isn't he? Isn't Rob Bradley here in Texas? I think he has the Institute for Energy here in Texas, who I've met several times, and me. I met Murray in 1974. He was thrilled that there was an economic geographer from Rutgers who was going to write a dissertation on inflation and how it spreads through the U.S. economy. And he got me an invitation to the first first Austrian conference in South Royalton, where he was there, Hazlitt was there, Ludwig von Lachmann was there, Kurzler was there, and Milton Friedman showed up, who didn't have very kind words about Austrian economics. Didn't have very kind words. Good, because he doesn't understand a lot of what the Austrians are saying. Anyway, here's another question. I've been writing about the economy since the 1970s, and I've written 4 books since I retired in the last 3 years, and 5 books since my Why the Federal Reserve Sucks comes out. One thing I've concluded, which I don't think any Austrian has written about this, and I'm really surprised, because in writing about the medical care system, writing about the economy, the boom-bust cycle, there's one word that I've been using on radio and TV interviews that I've been doing for the past 2 years in promoting my books. Anyone want to guess what that word is? If you were asked for $1 million, what word best describes the U.S. economy? What word would you use? I'm not going to give you $1 million, but what word would you use?
Crony.
What?
Crony.
Okay, that's the negative side. I want the positive side about the U.S. economy. What? No. It begins with an R.
Manipulated.
That's not the English alphabet.
Resilient.
Attaboy, resilient, resilient. No matter what the federal government has thrown at the economy, since the beginning of the Republic, with the cronyism, with the banking panics, with the income tax, with the Federal Reserve, with the wars, with the regulation, entrepreneurs, men and women entrepreneurs, have created an incredible economy here. Incredible. Just think of what life was like 20, 30 years ago. You can go to the internet, order an item on Amazon late at night, and it's there the next day. Think of the logistics of that. Those of you that are old enough to remember 800 numbers with Sears and Montgomery Ward, it would take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to get an order shipped to you using an 800 number. Now it's less than 24 hours. And of course, the array of products that we have is really incredible. And you can pick up your cell phone and call anyone in the world at virtually no cost. We can do teleconferences at virtually no cost. That's the really good news. What's the bad news? Joe Biden's in the White House. And the two-party system, which I called, by the way, in 1971, when Nixon did wage price controls, I said, we no longer have a two-party system. Now it's called the Uniparty. I called it in 1971, the Washington Party, with 2 wings, Republicans and Democrats. And the problem with Republicans is something I said during my 1997 gubernatorial campaign, when I was speaking at Rutgers to a large political science class taught by 2 consultants, one Republican, one Democrat. I spoke for about a half hour. I basically said, what would New Jersey look like under libertarian policy? And I went through the whole litany of that. And then one student in the back raised his hand, the first question, he said, Dr. Sabrin, you say you believe in free enterprise, limited government, and personal responsibility. What makes you different than a Republican? Immediately I said, I mean it. And that's the truth. I've heard for more than, 50 years, Republicans saying they believe in fiscal responsibility, individual rights, free enterprise, limited government, And yet, look at the federal budget under both Republicans and Democrats. You couldn't tell who's in the White House. That takes me to what we're going to talk about, the economy. For many years, I taught the financial history of the United States. I can tell you, students loved it, but basically finance majors. They absolutely loved the course. Why? It gave them insight to how our economy evolved from the eyes of finance. And we went through the colonial period, through the 19th century, and up into the present. And here's something I uncovered in putting the course together. There seems to be an unexplained 100-year cycle in America. Let me give you the data. The Panic of 1819, the topic of Rothbard's dissertation at Columbia, which is the title of his book, 1962, The Panic of 1819. You can read it at the Mises.org website. It is considered the definitive book about the Panic of 1819. 100 years later, the Forgotten Depression that James Grant wrote about, 1920, virtually 100 years later. 100 years later, 2020, the COVID lockdowns. Okay. The Panic of 1873. 100 years later, the oil crisis of 1973. The Panic of 1907. The Great Recession of 2007, 2008. You see where this is going, folks? What's the next big event? 1929. 100 years forward, 2029. I'm not predicting that. All I'm saying is, for some unexplained reason, there are cycles or major crises that happen every 100 years. I don't know the answer. There's no Austrian explanation for that. It's just observable. It's just a fact. So how do we get possibly to another 1929 and 2029? That's what I'm going to be talking about. How do we get there? And we're getting there, by the way. We are absolutely getting there. In looking over the current economic conditions and what happened in the 1920s, it's virtually identical. We started the decade in 1920 with the Spanish flu, right? And the Forgotten Depression. And then the Fed started ramping up the money supply. Rothbard writes about it in the case against the Fed, American Great Depression. And we have a couple of mini recessions in the 1920s, and then the big one comes in 1929. And Irving Fisher, a week before the market crash, or 10 days before the market crash, monetarist economist of Yale, said America has gone to a plateau of economic growth. One of the worst predictions in history. So, the 1920s and the 2020s are unfolding almost exactly the same. Right now, everyone's wondering, when is the Fed going to pivot? Because if you look at what's happened, and this is the really scary part, prior to the 2007-2008 crisis, the Fed owned about $900 billion of assets, Treasury securities, basically. During the crisis, it went up to nearly $3 trillion, more than tripling. Then there was a big ramp up. This is all from the Federal Reserve database, by the way. Then we went from virtually $3 trillion in federal assets to $4.5 trillion in the 2012-2014 period. Then COVID hit, and here's the stunning thing. The Fed's assets went from 3.8 trillion to 7 trillion literally overnight. It nearly doubled its balance sheet, buying up mortgage-backed securities and treasury debt. And then Powell just gunned it, and then it went from 7 trillion to 9 trillion in a couple of years. And then the geniuses at the Fed tell us, we're surprised inflation's occurring. They have 400 PhDs on staff at the Fed, and no one knows that when the Fed's balance sheet goes from $1 trillion to $9 trillion, this is Zimbabwe type of monetary policy. And yet they're clueless. It's transitory. Yes, it's transitory. We're not going to have high inflation forever. Okay? So what was the result of the Fed's expanding its balance sheet? Basically creating money out of thin air, right? The Fed has the unlimited checking account. Wouldn't we wish we all had an unlimited checking account? I could support the Mises Caucus like you wouldn't believe if I had an unlimited checking account. Okay, or any other organization. So look what happened to the money supply. It grew by over 25% in 1 year, in 2020. This is not Biden's inflation. I wish the conservatives and the Republicans would stop saying it's Biden. It's the Powell inflation. In fact, I would go far as to say it's the Trump inflation. Because if you remember in 2019, Powell was raising interest rates at the Fed, and Trump publicly scolded the Fed for raising interest rates. So what did the Fed do? It lowered interest rates when it was raising interest rates to stop the incipient inflation that was occurring at the time. So if you want to blame inflation, you blame Powell and Trump for egging Powell on. And isn't the Fed supposed to be independent? Don't we hear this all the time? The Fed is independent of politics? That is nonsense. That is the biggest myth in America. So the money supply went up, the Fed funds went to zero, close to zero. Could you imagine getting zero on our savings account when inflation is running at 2%? That means we're losing 2% a year on our purchasing power. The Mises Institute published a wonderful article a couple of years ago. $4 trillion in interest was lost by the American people because of the Fed's policy of zero interest rates. That is the biggest robbery in the history of the planet, possibly of the galaxy and the universe. $4 trillion went from our pockets to Wall Street and the big borrowers. Unconscionable. And no one's done a mea culpa. And what's happened to consumer prices? The charts that I'm referring to all come to the Federal Reserve database, a wonderful website. If you've got the time, you can go peruse the 500,000 charts they have. I mean, it is an absolute treasure chest of information that we Austrians use to explain what's going on in the economy. It's really remarkable. And so what happened to the consumer price index? It went from virtually 0 to 9% in a year. This is similar to what happened, by the way, in the 60s and 70s. The last inflation cycle we had lasted from the mid-60s, the Great Society programs and the Vietnam War, till the early 80s. 17 years of an inflation cycle. Inflation accelerated, decelerated, accelerated, decelerated. We may be on the verge of another one that could crack in 2029, 2030, 2031. So that's where we are with that. Okay. GDP, of course, plunged during the COVID. Again, this is not a typical business cycle recession. It was the COVID implosion because of the lockdowns. Then it went up, and now it's coming down again. People are now debating, are we going to have a recession? Well, I wrote a piece for Fortune magazine that was published in December 2021, almost a year and a half ago, saying the recession is going to begin in the second half of 2023, which is right around the corner. It's going to happen. I just did an update of that column. And what is one of the key indicators we look at? The inverted yield curve. When the yield curve inverted, I have that chart right here. Here it is. The yield curve inverted in 2021, and it takes 12 to 18 months for the recession to unfold. So we're right on target. Again, here's the chart from the Federal Reserve showing the inverted yield curve. Okay? Short-term rates minus long-term rates. And going back to the 1960s, every time we've had it, we've had a recession. So this time it's not different. The other indicator that is really interesting is the unemployment rate. We have very low unemployment rate. However, that's the good news. The bad news is, because of the business cycle created by the Fed, the unemployment rate today is exactly where it was in past cycles when the recession begins. So we're on the cusp of another recession. How deep it will be, is hard to forecast. We do know the high-tech companies expanded like crazy during COVID. They've been laying off people. Companies from across the tech sector have been laying off people. Bed Bath & Beyond just went belly up. Retailers are starting to feel this thing. Now that's both a business cycle phenomenon and also a business phenomenon because they were very late getting into e-commerce. Companies that expanded wildly because of the lockdowns and stay-at-home work, they're starting to shed employees. When the unemployment rate starts to tick up, it will accelerate very rapidly, and that's what the data show. Once unemployment starts to tick up, that's when the recession really begins in earnest, and that's when the unemployment claims start rising. That's posted every week, and the unemployment data every month. So we are on the cusp of another recession. What does that mean? Wash, rinse, repeat. The Fed will come in and start lowering rates, and then we're off to another big stock market boom. Remember, the stock market has been in a downturn since early 2022. That's when the all-time peak occurred. It hasn't gone past that yet. So the stock market has been forecasting a recession like it has in the past. So here's where we are, folks. The Fed will pivot. How low it will drop interest is problematic, because what if inflation stays relatively high, 4, 5, 6%? Because the service sector inflation is now one of the key drivers of the CPI. I don't know about Austin, but in Florida, we see signs all the time, starting at $15 an hour. The minimum wage is totally irrelevant today. What is it, $8, $10 an hour? You can't get people at $15 an hour. So the minimum wage, as free market economists say, is totally irrelevant. The marketplace is going to determine what the wage will be, not the government's fiat. How are we doing on time, Amy? 7 minutes, okay. 7 minutes, I'm going to start pitching how we get from here to there, which is a heavy lift, given that we have a $7 trillion budget, folks. $7 trillion, $32 trillion of debt. Interest on the debt is roughly, what, $500-600 billion a year. There are projections that it'll be $1 trillion a year in interest on the federal debt by the end of this decade. We're looking at Zimbabwe type of numbers here. What concerns me the most is that Biden, in the next 12 months, could impose wage price controls, capital controls, and all sorts of controls. You saw what's happening May 1st. If you have a great credit rating, you're punished. If you have a low credit rating, you're going to get a benefit courtesy of the federal government. Could there be anything more perverse than that? That's like giving the MVP award to a 220 batter in baseball. This is what makes me very pessimistic about where we're headed. So how do we address this? And this is one of the reasons I wrote my memoir. I originally was going to write the memoir about the 97 campaign, because although it was only a 6-week campaign from September 19th of 97 to Election Day. And when I spoke to Michael Harrison, the publisher of it, who publishes Talkers.com, the Bible of Talk Radio, he said, "Murray, you have a more compelling story than just the 97 campaign. Write about your coming to America in 1949, son of Holocaust survivors, how you went through the New York City schools, got a PhD, and eventually got a job at Brown Cove teaching finance for 35 years and running for office." I said, okay. So last June, I sat down with a bucket of articles from the 97 campaign, plus remembering everything that happened to me of importance in a memoir, and I started writing it, and I wrote it in 3 months. And then it was published, as I said, in November 9th of last year on the anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. So the reason I wrote this book is I hope it's an inspiration for a lot of young people, and of course everyone else who reads it, because my personal life story is one about perseverance, positive mental attitude, and a little bit of luck. And when you mix that in, that's what got me to where I am. And because of my wife's support, I was able to go to graduate school full-time starting in 1972, and eventually got the job at Ramapo College, strictly by accident, by the way. It was something that was not planned. In fact, there was a series of challenges before then that got me that job. And without her support, I wouldn't be here speaking to you today, because there's no way I would have written these books if I had stayed in the private sector and worked in real estate or finance or whatever. And so the strategy that I have for this book, and I've written it on my Substack column, by the way. My business card is out there with my Substack information and my email and so on. Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776, let me take it down memory lane, ignited the American Revolution when it sold 100,000 plus copies in a nation of less than 3 million. Think about that. If you could sell 100,000 copies in America today, you're on the New York Times bestseller list. So what I've written in Substack is, given how many libertarians are out there, and there are a lot, All I would like to see is 20,000 libertarians buy 6 copies of the book, one for themselves and 5 as gifts for their friends, relatives, and colleagues. That would be 120,000 copies in a nation of 330 million. You're talking about a fraction of 1%. What that would allow me to do is, with the royalties I get, would be to increase my support for the Mises Caucus and other organizations that I've been supporting for the last 30 years, 40 years. That's a strategy. I was on a radio show this morning in St. Louis talking about the economy and Joe and Kamala, who, by the way, I don't think will be the Democratic nominees in 2024. The insiders want to get rid of Biden and Kamala. So what's going to happen? Biden is probably going to withdraw right before the convention next summer. The insiders will get together and pick Gavin Newsom from California, which means Kamala cannot be on the ticket. You knock off 2 birds with 1 stone. The worst in the history of the planet. I mean, by far, Kamala Harris, who is a senator, U.S. attorney, can't speak a coherent sentence. Have you heard her speak? I mean, she makes Homer Simpson seem like Shakespeare. I mean, I've been in the classroom, I've been on the campaign trail. If you cannot articulate a simple sentence about what you believe in and what your thoughts are, people are going to think you're a joke. And they're going to dismiss you as some kooky professor. And yet she's a heartbeat away from the presidency. This is scary stuff, folks. This is scary stuff. That's why I think the insiders are very worried, and that's why I think that's the plan. That's the grand plan. The question is, will it unfold the way I'm forecasting? As the physicist Niels Bohr say, prediction is hard, especially about the future. So anyway, I hope you take what I say with heart, embrace it, because 20,000 libertarians could. I've got a whole bunch of interviews scheduled this week on radio and TV. The talk show hosts love what I have to say. Every single one of them that I've been on, I've got to have you back for more time to discuss the issues. Because when you have facts, when you talk about finance, money and banking, the Federal Reserve, the economy, and it's said in a way that the average person can understand it, even Joe and Kamala can understand it, you have an impact. You have an impact. What is it? What is this statement? I forgot. It takes nothing but a small minority to change the course of history, and that's exactly what's happened. So I hope you go back to your communities. You like what you hear. You pick up some books today, and my lovely wife will be able to take you $7. I'll sign it for you. That's free, by the way. The signature is free. And we can start something that Michael has started. You're here because you want to see change. Let's do the change, not for the good of the country. Thank you very much.
Murray, thank you. And do make sure you stop out and see his wonderful wife, Florence. She's out there with his books. Pop over and say hi. I'm going to bring up our second speaker. In New York, I had the pleasure of introducing Mike Maharrey as well, and I'm grateful to be able to do it again. While we all know and love Mike for his work at the 10th Amendment Center, something you might not know is he's also become a resource for our growing candidate program at runaslibertarian.com, offering training to those candidates so that they have the ability to exact a strategy of nullification, to push back against state and federal governments. And our candidates have had incredible feedback about the training. So you know him for his work at the 10th Amendment Center, but more recently and increasingly a resource for our candidates, hopefully for the ones here in Texas as well. So his support of this tour and of our efforts have been incredible. Mike, this is your second stop? Third stop. Oh my goodness gracious. Third stop with us. Mike is the communications director at the 10th Amendment Center, a contributor to multiple podcasts, but you already know that. I'm grateful he's here. Mike, come on up.
She says, you know and love me, but do you really? So good morning, Texas. As Amy said, this is my third stop on the Take Human Action tour. I was in New York for the first one, then in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, and today in the great state of Texas. And I have to tell you that Texas gave me the greatest adventure of these 3 trips. I actually flew in last night right in front of the thunderstorm. And when I say right in front of the thunderstorm, I mean like we're flying, I can see it. And I've done a lot of flying. I actually used to work in the airline industry, and in my brain I'm thinking, we're not landing this plane in Austin. I was convinced we were going to get diverted to Dallas and have to sit. I was like, And I'm getting over being pretty sick, so I don't feel good. And I got to give that Southwest pilot credit because he was landing the damn plane in Austin. You could tell. And when he took that turn to make the final approach into the runway, when they gave him clearance, he banked that thing and drove it like Kyle Busch in a NASCAR race. So that was fun. But anyway, I'm really glad to be here. As I said, I am actually getting over the coronavirus, which is not pleasant. So I'm not contagious. I tested negative, but I'm still dragging a little bit. So I'm going to do my best to bring as much energy and excitement to this as I can, because it's early in the morning, and who wants to sit here and not be energized, right? So I enjoy bumper stickers on cars. And you can determine a lot about a person's worldview by looking at the bumper stickers on the back of their car. And what I've determined, after seeing hundreds and hundreds of cars with bumper stickers, is that most people's worldview is very confused. I'll give you the perfect example. It's the thin blue line bumper sticker next to the come and take it bumper sticker, right? You're not going to get my guns. And I always want to go bang on the side of the truck because there's always a truck. And I want to say, dude, who do you think is going to come and take it? It's the thin blue line people. And then you've got another one. You don't see this as much anymore because we've moved on, but you used to see a lot of the Barack Obama next to like the peace symbol or world peace, as if the droner in chief was the exemplary figure for peace in our times. So bumper stickers. I was behind a car not too long ago in my hometown of Tarpon Springs, Florida. And this woman was also very confused about her worldview. And the first bumper sticker was just, it was black and white. It just had one word, resist, with the exclamation point. I'm like, so far so good. I could get down with some resistance. Would anybody care to take a guess at what the bumper sticker right next to resist was? Biden. Like, are you kidding me? Worst resistance ever, right? We've got arguably the biggest, most powerful government in the history of the world. We've got a government that claims the power to tell you what kind of light bulbs you can have in your fixtures, how much water you can have in your toilet, what plant you can grow in your backyard. And this woman is going to resist this corrupt, evil system by voting for Joe Biden. That's not how resistance works, right? If you've got a corrupt, evil, massive, overpowering system that is oppressing virtually everybody in some way, you don't fix it, you don't resist it by changing out the guy running it. You take a wrench to it, you throw a monkey wrench in the system, and if you can, you smash it, right? But she's going to resist by voting Joe Biden. And that, honestly, seems to be the mentality of most people in the United States when it comes to resistance. We're going to fix it by getting a new president because the rights know better. I mean, they're going to fix it with Donald Trump. That worked out well. So, yeah, we have a system that's broken, right? And if you have a broken down car and it's sitting on blocks, it won't go anywhere. You're not going to fix it by changing out the driver, right? You got to fix the system. We've got a broken system. So what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about real resistance. I want to talk about something that we can do within the political system as it exists to push back against this overreaching monster state that we're faced with every single day. Real resistance. Now, as Amy said, I am the National Communications Director for the 10th Amendment Center. How many people are familiar with the 10th Amendment Center? Pretty much everybody. Cool. So you know that the 10th Amendment Center, we talk a lot about the Constitution. In fact, I have a book. It's called Constitution's Owner's Manual. It's about the Constitution. It goes through all of the various clauses, what they're supposed to mean, the philosophical bedrock of the Constitution, all of these kind of things. And this is my shameless plug. I don't want to take these home. So you could buy them from me for $20. I'd really appreciate it. That's my shameless capitalist plug for the day. But you might be thinking, okay, Mike, you know, your Constitution, maybe not really great resistance either, you know? And I get that. That's fair. And I bet there is somebody in here. I bet a large sum of money, in fact, that somebody right now is thinking about Lysander Spooner. Am I right? Yeah, right here in the front. I knew there was always somebody. You all know the famous quote, but whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is. Thank you. Now, honestly, I've always kind of thought this is a dumb guy quote. Sorry, Lysander. Much respect. And honestly, I think what he said about the idea of consent, nobody consented to this, brilliant, absolutely correct. My inner anarchist embraced that wholly. But this single quote that's often taken just out of context, it's funny because I've read a lot of Spooner. And most of the people that quote this thing, they're like, it's some kind of, gotcha, Maharrey, ha, you and your Constitution, ha. Like, I've never heard this before. I've been doing this for 12 years. I know the quote. Thanks. But the thing about it is Spooner is actually wrong on both counts in that quote. First off, it certainly did not authorize such a government. Everybody who supported the Constitution went out of their way to assure naysayers that it didn't. And it is, in fact, a legal document. If you read my book, you'll understand that. It is based in contract law. So we actually know exactly what it did and did not authorize. It did not authorize this massive state that we have today. Federalist number 45, James Madison, pitching the Constitution, trying to get people to ratify it. He said, the powers delegated to the federal government by this proposed Constitution are few and defined. Those which remain with the states and the people are numerous and indefinite. And then he said that most of the powers that would be given to the federal government would deal with things like war, peace, commerce, with foreign nations, things like that. He said all of the things that pertain to the life, liberties, and prosperity of the people and the internal improvements of the state would remain with the state and the people. That's what the Constitution actually authorized. It's a legal document. Now, of course, it doesn't look anything like that. So I guess Spooner was right when he said it was powerless to prevent it. And I'll concede this point based on the evidence. But where I think Spooner kind of goes off the rails is that nobody actually thought the Constitution was going to prevent something, because it is parchment with words on it. And parchments with words don't do anything other than sit there and be parchment with words. See, Spooner smuggles an assumption into this statement that somehow the Constitution was going to enforce itself, which is absurd. What's your name right here in front? Dick? Nick. Let's say you and I enter into a contract, right? Be for whatever, doesn't matter. We write it out, certain terms, things I'm supposed to do, things you're supposed to do, I immediately stop doing all of the things that I'm supposed to do. If Nick here simply waves the contract around and says, Maharrey's being a poo-poo duty head, he won't do this, you're not going to feel sorry for him, right? Do something about it. You have to enforce the contract, right? You would take me to court. You would do something to ensure that I live up to my end of the bargain. That's how contracts work. People that quote this Spooner thing to me, they act like, well, the Constitution didn't work. Ha, ha, ha. No, the Constitution wasn't enforced. It's like any contract, it has to be enforced. John Dickinson was known as the penman of the Revolution. Very influential in writing in the years leading up to the War for Independence. A strong advocate for fighting back against what he believed was British overreach into colonial rights. He wrote that it's ultimately up to the supreme sovereignty of the people. He wrote, it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved. So it's up to us, right? If there is a failure in this, it wasn't the Constitution, it was the people, us, our unwillingness or inability to, or apathy, or whatever it is, that caused us not to enforce this legal document. Now, why bother with the Constitution, though? Because, as I said, I am a philosophical anarchist. I'm a voluntarist. I do this Constitution stuff for pragmatic reasons. And that's because if I go out here in the hall and start asking people about voluntarism, start trying to explain, hey, we don't need a state. They don't look at me like I got 3 horns and I'm nuts. It's just where we are. It's where most people are. We have to understand where people are. Now, if I go to anybody and start talking about the Constitution, there's a starting point because pretty much everybody in America believes it has some kind of something, right? So it gives you a place to start within the system as it exists. There's a great quote by Murray Rothbard. He said, parenting ultimate principles is not enough to deal with the real world. We have to have some actionable things. The Constitution gives us that gateway that we can work within the system. So that's why I do the Constitution thing. It's not because I love constitutions. It's not because I believe it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I didn't sign up for this. But it's what we have. It's a place to start. Now, believe it or not, this actually brings me back to Spooner, which surprises a lot of people when I say that. But before he wrote No Treason, which was after the war between the states, he actually gave a blueprint for enforcing the Constitution. This was in 1850. In 1850, there was a law that was passed by Congress known as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In my view, one of the most awful, draconian laws ever passed by the U.S. Congress. It was all basically to set up a way to capture runaway slaves who go into the North. And it did a lot of horrible things. The worst thing is that as a white person, I could go into Ohio or Massachusetts or wherever, find a black person, say, hey, that's my property, drag them off before a magistrate, and it's my word against this person that I'm accusing. They had no right to any kind of jury trial. They had no right to testify. They got nothing. If I said that they were my property, pretty much any magistrate and judge was going to be, all right, see ya, because they didn't care. To make it worse, these magistrates who did these fugitive slave rendition hearings, they actually got $10 if the slave was returned to the owner, and they only got $5 if they determined that it wasn't a legit claim. What do you think happened most of the time? So we had this Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. As you probably know, if you're a Spooner acolyte, he was a staunch abolitionist. And he wrote this paper. It was called A Defense of Fugitive Slaves. And I highly recommend looking it up and reading it. It's very interesting. Most people have read No Treason. They've never read this. And he first makes the case that slavery was unconstitutional. Kind of contrived legal argument, but whatever, he makes that case. But what is significant for our discussion here is he went on and he said, okay, so if this is unconstitutional, what are we going to do about it? Listen to what Spooner wrote. He said, an unconstitutional statute is no law in the view of the Constitution. It is void, he wrote, and it confers no authority on anyone, and whoever attempts to execute it does so at his peril. Gotta love Spooner, he had a way with words. He goes on and tells us how we should go about it. He says we should resist. He said the right of the people, therefore, to resist an unconstitutional law is absolute and unqualified from the moment the law is enacted. Spooner's nobody's heard. James Iredell was one of the first Supreme Court justices. And he made a similar point. He said, the right of the people, therefore, to resist an unconstitutional law is absolute, unqualified from the moment it was enacted. That sounds an awful lot like what Spooner said. I think Spooner actually lifted it from Iredell. So, that brings us to the question. I think everybody in here agrees if somebody's doing something that's illegal, unjust, immoral, we have a right to resist. How do we do it? That's the key, right? Waving the Constitution around and yelling is not going to do it. So we have to have some type of mechanism. Now, I suppose you could go the violence route. I'm not a fan of violence. I am of the opinion that a violent revolution, in all likelihood, is just going to produce another violent government down the road. That's a whole other philosophical discussion. But I don't think most people